I am super excited to be here in Cincy for the first time. Hopefully the weather will get better. Last week in Toronto, a single Wednesday night seat blinked out of availability roughly 90 seconds after it appeared. Then another, then 2,000 more. Alex Eala had not even walked onto the court yet. She was, at that moment, a 21-year-old Filipina seated into the Canadian Open and scheduled for a second-round match. The kind of match that in a normal WTA 1000 week does not sell out anything, let alone a stadium. And yet, according to the tournament's own director, the entire Wednesday night session was gone in 30 minutes. Our stadium is 10,077 seats and tickets sold, and boom, it was sold out on Wednesday night. Volunteers who had been given seats had to trade them back for a different day. That single detail, one line in a news conference, one number spoken out loud, is the small object that this whole story turns on. Because today, August 15th, Alex Eala walks onto a court in Cincinnati as the 17th seed, and the tournament director who inherited a $260 million building is now quietly doing the same math Toronto did. Here is what you need to hold in your head. 12 days ago, on August 3rd, Eala beat the world number 3, Jessica Pegula, from a set down, 4-6, 6-4, 6-0, to win the DC Open, her first WTA Tour title, and the first ever won by a player from the Philippines. 4 days after that in Toronto, she beat Alicia Parks and then Katie McNally before losing in the round of 16 to Belinda Bencic, 4-6, 0-6. On the Monday after Toronto, the WTA rankings moved her to a career-high world number 20. She is the first Filipino, man or woman, to enter the top 20 in the modern era.
That is the resume she carried into Cincinnati this week, into the newly transformed Lindner Family Tennis Center, into a first-round bye, into a second-round match against Elena Gabriela Rus of Romania. That is the on-court story. The off-court story is the one nobody outside a few tournament offices has been talking about, and it is the one this video is actually about. The word in the title is demand, and it is important before we go any further to be honest about what that word means here. Alex Eala has not demanded anything of Bob Moran, the Cincinnati Open's tournament director. There is no leaked email, no backroom ultimatum, no fee dispute, no scheduling war. The demand is not a demand from her. The demand is a demand for her, measured in tickets sold, in resale prices, in the emails hitting box office inboxes, in the flags counted at gate scans, in the way an operational team decides which court a match will be played on and at what hour of the day. That is what has, according to people who work in this world for a living, quietly stunned the operators of the Cincinnati Open. And to be fair to Bob Moran, who is, on paper, cast as the surprised institution in this story, he is not a man being ambushed. He is a man who spent the last 2 years telling anyone who would listen that this tournament wanted to become a global 2-week experience on par with the majors. He raised the money. He oversaw the campus expansion, doubling the site to more than 40 acres, adding a 56,000 square foot player center, 31 courts, and a redesigned fan campus. His public brief, as recently as this year's field reveal, was that Cincinnati was ready to welcome, in his words, the world's best players. What Moran did not necessarily plan for is that one of those players would arrive carrying an audience the tournament had never sold to before. Let's walk through what actually happened in Toronto, because it is the only place where the tournament industry side of this phenomenon has been publicly documented, and it is the template Cincinnati is now in real time updating for its own use. Toronto's tournament director Carl Hale said in a news conference that when the ticketing team began flagging inbound requests for Eala's schedule before the draw was even out, the volume was unusual enough to force a conversation about court assignment. This is not fan folklore. This is Hale on the record telling reporters, including The Athletic, that a sellout Wednesday night this early in a tournament is, in his phrasing, really unheard of. That is the first data point. The second data point is quieter and in some ways more revealing. According to The Athletic's reporting, the person inside the Canadian Open who first noticed the pattern and escalated it was Jason Maglante, Tennis Canada's head of ticketing, who is himself of Filipino heritage. He had been hearing directly from members of the Toronto Filipino diaspora who were tracking Eala's results and asking when, not if, but when she would play. That is a specific operational detail that almost no one outside the tournament's back office would ever know. And it matters because it tells you that this surge is not something that happens to a tournament by accident. It gets noticed first by the person whose job it is to notice, and it gets acted on before the general public ever sees a schedule. The third data point is the tournament's on-the-day response. In Toronto, they chose to put Eala on center court on Wednesday night. Grandstand, the venue that would normally host a second-round match of an unseeded pair, was not enough. And by the time the gates opened, according to reporting on the ground, the concourses looked less like an early week WTA session and more like a final. There were Philippine flags at nearly every turn. One food vendor swapped a chicken teriyaki bowl for a chicken adobo option. A small operational detail that is genuinely more telling than most highlight packages. Tournaments do not change menus for 17th seeds. They change menus when their internal data tells them a new audience has arrived. Now bring that pattern to Cincinnati. The Lindner Family Tennis Center is not the venue it was 2 years ago. By Much Sports and Entertainment, the company Moran leads, invested $260 million. That figure is confirmed by the ATP Tour, by Barton Mallow, the construction firm involved, and by the Cincinnati Open's own campus transformation page. The stated goal was scale. More courts, more players, a longer main draw, a tournament that behaves commercially and experientially like a fifth slam. That is the argument Moran has been making publicly for 2 years. And here is the quiet part, the part that lives behind the curtain. For that argument to work, Cincinnati needs to prove that the expansion has expanded the audience, not just deepened the existing one, expanded it. A new demographic, a new market, ideally a global one, which is more or less the exact demographic that has been showing up at Alex Eala's matches for the last 4 weeks. Take a breath here because it is worth naming what the on-court story looks like alongside the off-court one. Eala arrived in Cincinnati having posted a 7-1 record on North American hard courts this summer. She has a first-round bye. Her second-round match is against Roos, who is ranked at a career high of 51, and who advanced by beating Magda Linette 6-0, 6-3. If Eala wins, her draw sharpens quickly. The projected round of 32 opponent is a step up. The potential round of 16 collision with Linda Noskova is already circled by every draw analyst who has looked at this bracket. And beyond that, Iga Swiatek and Elena Rybakina wait on her half of the draw. That is the reality of being the 17th seed at a WTA 1000. The ceiling is high and the floor is unforgiving. But return to the operational side, because there is one more piece of evidence that ties it all together. And it comes from the locker room, not the box office. Coco Gauff in Toronto told reporters that it is great for the sport that one player can bridge the gap between the game and a nation that had not previously had that kind of representation. Venus Williams, who partnered Eala in doubles in Toronto, and again briefly this summer, called her a world star. Jessica Pegula, the player Eala beat for her first title, publicly acknowledged that Eala's fans had driven a measurable surge in traffic to her own podcast on YouTube. That is not a fan page claim. That is one top 5 player talking in a news conference about the second-order effects of Eala's audience on her own business. When peers on the tour begin volunteering that language, tournament operators are not far behind. This is where the ordinary framing of a tennis rise stops being sufficient. Because what we are watching is not really the story of a talented young player breaking into the top 20. That story is real and it is remarkable and it is documented. But if you only tell it that way, you miss the machinery underneath. Carl Hale, who has been running the Canadian Open for years, said in plain language that what happened in Toronto had no easy comparable in his experience. That is the authority quote in this story. It is not dressed up. It is not hyperbolic. It is a man whose job is to have a baseline for normal telling reporters that Eala is outside the baseline. That is the sentence Cincinnati's operations team read. And that is the sentence they are right now planning against. The scale of this, if you want to be honest about it, has one useful historical comparable, and it is not the one you are probably expecting. Set aside the reflexive comparisons for a moment. Think instead about Lina. In 2011, when Lee broke through and won the French Open, the WTA's revenue map in East Asia essentially redrew itself inside 18 months. Tournaments were added, sponsors moved, ticketing operations in Chinese language markets were built from scratch. What Eala is doing to Southeast Asia, and specifically to a Philippine market that has, by the Cincinnati Open's own reporting, historically had almost no professional tennis infrastructure, is not culturally identical to Lina, but it is structurally similar. It is market formation in real time on the ticket sales side of the sport, and it is happening right now at a venue whose entire recent capital expenditure story was built on the premise that this kind of global expansion is possible. Bob Moran's $260 million bet needs a face. It found one it did not budget for. That is the room behind the curtain. That is the story the title of this video is gesturing toward. Even if the language of the title is louder than the reality is quieter, and in some ways more interesting. An operator whose expansion thesis is being validated faster than his infrastructure can adjust for.
And through all of it, Eala herself has been, by any honest read, remarkably measured. On August 10th in Toronto, she lost to Belinda Bencic 4-6, 0-6, a bagel set, a brutal way to end a run that had been, until that moment, one of the best months of her career. She said publicly afterward that she would take a brief rest before Cincinnati. Then, on the eve of her second round match here, she sat in the pre-tournament press conference and, when asked about the noise around her, said that there are moments when it is heavy and moments when it is fun. She said she is still, in her words, very, very far from the levels of the players she is trying to reach. On Instagram from Toronto, she posted a phrase in her own language that translates roughly to, a warm and playful acknowledgement that Toronto had, for a week, felt like a village of her own back home. That is the tone, grateful, deflective, unhurried. She is not asking to be treated like the story tournaments are quietly starting to treat her as. Which brings us finally to the rooms, because the closing image of this story is not on a court. It is in 3 or 4 offices whose names most viewers will never see. It is in the Cincinnati Open ticketing office, where a 17th seed is being tracked on their internal dashboards the way a top 4 seed would be. It is in the BMAC boardroom, where a $260 million expansion needed a face that could carry a global argument, and where Alex's audience is quietly being written into next year's projections. It is in a Tennis Canada office in Toronto, where a Filipino head of ticketing named Jason Maglante turned an inbox pattern into a Wednesday night sellout, and without meaning to, wrote the playbook every subsequent tournament on the calendar is now consulting. And it is, most of all, in whichever quiet corner of the Cincinnati site Alex Eala is sitting in right now before her match, trying to keep her focus on Elena Gabriela Ruse, and only on Elena Gabriela Ruse. That is the room she is in now. The rest, the boardrooms, the ticketing dashboards, the peer testimonials, the $260 million building that suddenly has a new argument for itself, is going on around her whether she looks up or not. Whatever happens today against Ruse, and whatever happens next against Noskova or Rybakina, or at the US Open the week after next, those are the rooms she is already inside. Bob Moran is not stunned by Alex Eala. He is, if anything, quietly grateful. Where the ones who saw the 30-minute sellout first stay until the next dashboard updates,